Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Duncan Petrie and it's a great pleasure to be here to give you this lecture on Otto Heller and British cinema. So the focus of my lecture today is an examination of the arguably unappreciated contribution made by the prolific Czech cinematographer Otto Heller to British cinema. Heller enjoyed a long and distinguished career in film production, beginning in 1918 and lasting more than 50 years, ending with his death in 1970 at the age of 73. During that time, Heller amassed an astonishing array of credits. He photographed around 230 feature films, and his career can be divided into 4 periods. The first decade saw Heller establish himself in the Czech film industry during the silent era. And as national film industries in Europe began to see the benefits of collaboration, so Heller began working regularly between Czechoslovakia and Germany from around 1928. This was also an extraordinarily prolific period that saw him shoot an average of 10 feature films a year. So he was working all the time. Then the rise of Nazism marked a decisive turn away from German-based productions, and in the latter half of the 1930s we see Heller shooting his first films in Britain, as well as productions in the Netherlands and in France. Then the outbreak of World War II saw Heller emigrate to London. He became a British subject in 1945, and he remained based in the UK for the rest of his career. Now, Otto Heller's long career spans periods of major change and transformation in the filmmaking practices, in techniques, and in technology. He became a cinematographer during the silent era, before graduating to sound films from 1930, and then later shooting his first colour and widescreen films in the early 1950s. Like other top directors of photography, Heller was a highly versatile professional, skilled in lighting and photographing different kinds of genres, subjects and styles, in the studio and on location. This versatility distinguishes his UK-based career, which happened to coincide with a period that saw the production values and the international profile of British cinema rise considerably. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, a cinematographer is responsible for the look of a film through lighting and photography. And this requires high levels of artistic, technical, and practical skill and knowledge, in addition to the ability to collaborate effectively with others. This includes not only key creatives, such as the director, the production designer, and the actors, but also members of the camera and lighting crew, most notably the camera operator. And while there was a trend dating from the 1960s of some cinematographers, mainly who had come from documentary, preferring to operate the camera as well as light, Otto Heller was of a generation where these roles were very, very separate. So on all of his films there are camera operators rather than him doing it. So, Otto Heller was born into a Jewish family in Prague on the 8th of March, 1896. As a teenager, he became a projectionist in the Lucerna cinema in Prague. During World War I, he served as a field projectionist on the Italian front, before being transferred to military film laboratories in Vienna, where he assisted the cinematography for the funeral of Emperor Franz Joseph in 1916. After the war ended, Heller began to work as a cinematographer on feature films back in his home city, notably for the company Praga Film. Heller established important working relationships with the actor-director Karl Lamach with whom he would work on more than 80 films between 1919 and 1943, including 4 that are screened in this festival, and with the actress Annie Ondra, or Ondrakova, best known in the UK as the star of Alfred Hitchcock's 1929 film Blackmail, which was the first British talking picture. And Heller would work with Ondra on more than 50 films. Other key collaborators include directors Vaclav Wasserman and Martin Fritsch, who Heller worked with on 35 and 28 films respectively. And examples of Heller's work with Lamach and Fritsch are also included in this festival. As previously noted, Heller found himself working increasingly in Germany during the early 1930s, including on several productions made by Ondra Lamach Films. His first sound film was Das Kabinett des Dr. Larifari, directed by Robert Walmuth in 1930, which is a spoof on the expressionist classic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Transnational co-production was a prominent feature of European cinema from the late 1920s, and during the early sound period, many films were made in different language versions. Heller photographed more of 10 of these alternate productions, primarily in Czech and German, or a few in German and French, including several with Lamach and Ondra, and this includes this example, Kiki, from 1932, made in French and German versions. When the rise of Nazism became too much of a threat, Heller finally left Czechoslovakia in 1938 with Lamach. The two made the Dutch film De Spooktrain in 1939, and later worked on the British production They Met in the Dark 1943, which was their final collaboration. However, Heller's first experience of British production had come in 1936 and 1937, when he shot 6 feature films in England. The first of these was The Amazing Adventure of Ernest Bliss, directed by the German Alfred Ziesler and co-produced by the Czech Otto Clement for United Artists. And what's interesting about it is it stars a very young Cary Grant in his first role as a freelance actor. Other productions during this period include Tomorrow We Live, Dreams Come True, The High Command, which was directed by Thorold Dickinson, with whom Heller would later work on The Queen of Spades, and 2 films with the French director Edmond T. Greville, Secret Lives and Mademoiselle Docteur, both made in 1937. Heller would work again with Greville on the French production Menace, around the same time that he photographed De Meyerling à Sarajevo for Max Ophuls, again in France. So these initial British assignments were made during a period that saw a great deal of mobility for key film creatives in Europe. Indeed, continental European émigrés played a major part in the artistic and technical development of British cinema, and among them were several talented cinematographers. And in addition to Heller, this group included fellow Czechs, Otto Kančurek, based in England from 1934, and he became the chief cameraman at Associated British Pictures Studio in Elstree, so a very important figure in the industry. Jan Stalic and Franz Planer, who would go on to have a successful career in Hollywood. But again, as I've said before, the rise of the Nazis, the outbreak of World War II, altered what had been for many a very mobile situation into one of, for many, permanent exile. So when Heller arrived in Britain, the outbreak of war had led to an initial reduction in film production by 70%. Many film technicians were called up and several studios were requisitioned for storage or shadow factory accommodation. But Heller was able to work, and he quickly established himself on mainly low-budget features for various companies, including several productions made at Teddington Studios in southwest London. This studio had been acquired by Hollywood company Warner Brothers First National in 1931 as a UK production base. Now, these early films that Heller worked on in the 40s were mainly war films, crime thrillers, but with the odd musical or comedy. In 1942, Heller also began an important association with camera operator Gus Striss. A collaboration was to last 15 years and include 25 features. But Heller's first notable British feature is I Live in Grosvenor Square, which was made in 1945, a wartime romance between an American soldier and a British woman in the Auxiliary Air Force, which starred Anna Neagle and Rex Harrison, and was directed and produced by Herbert Wilcox, a major figure in British cinema in the 1930s and 1940s. But Heller's first major artistic achievements are two low-budget productions, both distinguished by striking, low-key black and white cinematography and imaginative set design. And these are films that are showing in this festival. The first is They Made Me a Fugitive, which is showing today at 12:30, I think, at the Mir Cinema. This was directed by the Brazilian filmmaker Alberto Cavalcanti, who was then on contract to Ealing Studios. It was made at the Riverside Studio, a small facility in Hammersmith in London, with a growing reputation for low-budget productions. And the film was distributed by Warner Brothers. Now that's significant because They Made Me a Fugitive was part of a cycle of gangster or spiv films made in Britain, which were modelled on Hollywood's hard-boiled genre. And this was subsequently to be given the label film noir by French critics. The film concerns a former RAF officer who becomes involved with a gang involved in stolen goods. This was during a time of shortages and rationing in Britain. When Clem, the main character, realises that the gang are also dealing in narcotics, he wants to get out. But he is framed by the gang's ruthless leader, Narcy, for the accidental death of a policeman in a getaway and sent to Dartmoor prison. Clem subsequently escapes and returns to London to seek his revenge. Now, in this clip, we'll see the first signs of tension between the two men, brilliantly underpinned by the atmospheric lighting and cinematography. They Made Me a Fugitive provided Heller with the perfect material for a classic creative noir treatment. The action happens at night, we have confined sets, there's prolific use of low-key lighting, of shadows, of angled compositions, and Heller rose to the occasion using his skills to convey a powerful sense of claustrophobia and threat in this film. And you can see from the images here just how much it resembles the classic American film noir films in its look. The settings are also very evocative. The gang's hideout is a funeral parlour, and this features heavily in the climactic scenes. They Made Me a Fugitive also presents a very bleak portrayal of the human condition, epitomised by the cold, malevolence and brutality of Narcy, the villain. Perhaps most grotesquely in the sequence when he beats up Sally, his ex-girlfriend. A scene in which his true self is revealed in the distorting mirror, which is a recurring motif in Cavalcanti cinema. So the talents of the key creatives in this film, notably Heller, allowed They Made Me a Fugitive to transcend its modest budget, and it remains a standout example of the post-war British crime genre. Heller's next major creative achievement was The Queen of Spades, an adaptation of a novella by Alexander Pushkin and part of a series of 5 films that Heller worked on for the Russian-born producer Anatole de Grunwald. It reunited the cinematographer with director Thorold Dickinson, who joined the production after the original director Rodney Ackland had been fired, and also with the star Anton Walbrook, who Heller had worked on 4 films in Germany during the 1930s. The Queen of Spades was made at Welland Studios, a small, old-fashioned and badly soundproof facility. Every time a train passed, they had to stop shooting. But Heller and the designer Oliver Marcel compensated for the lack of space with their ingenuity and creativity. The film tells the Faustian tale of Countess Ravenskaya, an elderly woman who has sold her soul to the devil to win at cards. Captain Herman Savorin, played by Walbrook, is an embittered engineering officer who learns that the Countess has reputedly sold her soul, and he sets out to seduce the Countess's niece Lisaveta to gain access to the old woman. But this obsessive quest is to have grave consequences for Savorin. Now, once again, Heller had to rely on ingenuity to overcome budgetary limitations. This included inspired camera movement to evoke space in crowded scenes, most effectively in the ballroom scene you see at the top left. High-angled shots to disguise the lack of sets, some examples there. And wide-angled lenses to suggest space, and the bold use of shadows and low-key lighting. Much of it used to simulate candlelight. Now, the evocative Gothic style of the Queen of Spades invokes a world of fear, repression, and most notably, the encroachment of the supernatural, evoking classic German expressionist films in the process. This dominant mood is effectively demonstrated in the following clip. Okay, so Heller's placing of characters in the foreground of scenes is used to enhance this sense of claustrophobia that we get throughout the film. While the recurring use of mirrors is also a key expressionist motif that enhances a sense of a divided self or a psychic instability, but also of furtive surveillance and manipulation. This is a film where Savorin is constantly trying to manipulate the naive Lisaveta. The historian Geoffrey Richards has argued that, and I quote, "In its extravagance of style and setting, in its exuberant fluid camera style and expressionist lighting, in its mastery of the mechanics of suspense and suggestion, The Queen of Spades is a triumph of pure imagination and one of the classics of that era of high ambition and grand achievement in British filmmaking." and Heller's contribution is a major part of that. By the end of the 1940s, Otto Heller was well established in the front rank of cinematographers in Britain. He was one of the original 55 founding members of the British Society of Cinematographers in September 1949, which was a non-political guild made up of feature production cameramen inspired by the British Society of Cinematographers. So as we move into the 50s, and British cinema was impacted by two major developments, one industrial, the other technological. On one hand, the economic impact of World War II saw several European countries placing restrictions on the currency that could be remitted from foreign countries. And the response was to invest box office earnings in productions made in those countries, in what were called runaway productions. Effectively, Hollywood-backed films made in the UK, France, Italy, and elsewhere. But this coincided with the proliferation of films made in new widescreen systems like CinemaScope and VistaVision, and also in Technicolor. This is when we begin to see many more films being made in colour. Heller's first Technicolor film was The Crimson Pirate from 1952, a Warner Brothers production directed by Robert Siodmak and starring Burt Lancaster, who was also the co-producer. Lancaster then hired Heller for a subsequent film, His Majesty O'Keeffe, in 1954, which was also financed by Warner's. Among Heller's other Technicolor films in this period was The Man Who Watched Trains Go By, and two films made for Ealing Studios, The Rainbow Jacket, a drama set in the world of horse racing, and The Lady Killers, which I'll discuss in a moment. Heller made 5 films for Ealing. The first of those was not one of the comedies, it was The Square Ring, which is a gritty drama set in the world of boxing. And Heller's cinematography here features a blend of documentary realism and noirish imagery. Some of those impressive scenes are those set in the boxing ring, which are high contrast images bathed in a luminescent white light with backgrounds that recede into velvet darkness. This film also initiated a relationship with the director Basil Dearden and the producer Michael Relf that was to encompass 7 feature films over a 12-year period. But Heller's standout film for Ealing is unquestionably The Lady Killers, which is a real classic. This film was directed by Alexander Mackendrick, and it's widely considered to be the last of the great Ealing comedies. It tells the quirky story of a gang of robbers led by the sinister Professor Marcus, played by Alec Guinness, who used the house of an old lady, Mrs. Wilberforce, to plan their robbery, posing as a string quintet. After the heist, the old lady discovers what they've been up to, and in their attempts to dispose of her, they quarrel and end up bumping each other off. This is the moment when Professor Marcus first arrives at the house. Now, stylistically, this film is an interesting hybrid. On one hand, The Lady Killers draws on the familiar Ealing style of contemporary naturalism, and it makes very effective use of the central London locations around King's Cross and St Pancras stations. Mrs. Wilberforce's house, which you can see here on the top left, was especially built next to the railway line. And as we saw in the clip, everything in the house is a little crooked. The doors and corridors also had to be widened for the large 3-strip Technicolor camera to be used. But alongside the naturalism and the real sense of London, this is a heist movie that is an affectionate parody of the silent Fritz Lang thrillers, described by film historian Philip Kemp in terms of deranged master criminals, lopsided sets, and sinister expressionist shadows. And we got a very good example of that when Marcus arrives, which is an image that also invokes Alfred Hitchcock's film The Lodger, which is, was his first major film, a very expressionistic film where there's a scene exactly like this with the shadow at the door when the sinister lodger first arrives. Now, during his time at Ealing, Heller met Jerry O'Hara, an assistant director, who later went on to become a director himself. Now, O'Hara notes that Heller had gained a reputation as being a very fast cinematographer, and his ability to deliver high-quality work at speed was what endeared him to producers and led him to being hired by Sir Laurence Olivier for his new big-screen adaptation of Richard III, which was Olivier's third great Shakespearean film after Henry V, he made in 1944, and Hamlet in 1948. Now, Richard III was made in VistaVision. VistaVision was a big rather than a widescreen system that required a special camera through which the film ran not vertically but horizontally. The frame size was the equivalent of 2 standard 35mm frames, providing a large negative and thus a much higher definition image. Now, Richard III charts the rise and fall of the infamous English king and did much to confirm his reputation as a ruthless, scheming villain, responsible for the murder of the 2 young princes in the Tower. Having helped his brother, King Edward IV, take the throne of England, the jealous hunchback Richard, Duke of York, Olivier, plots to seize power for himself, masterfully deceiving and plotting against nearly everyone in the royal court, including his eventual wife, Lady Anne, and his brother George, Duke of Clarence. Richard orchestrates a bloody rise to power before finding all of his gains jeopardized by those he has betrayed. Now, the production makes a virtue of its theatrical origins. Heller uses deep focus, which works very well in VistaVision, long takes, and a mobile camera within the stylized sets that were designed by Carmen Dillon and Roger First. Now, this required using a lot of light on the sets to allow the camera aperture to be stopped down and the depth of field to be created. There's also a proliferation of close-ups and medium shots, and the camera remains very close to the key characters, both physically but also psychologically. And it becomes, if you like, Richard's confidant. What really marks this film out is the direct two-camera monologues that Olivier gives. Richard is depicted as askew in a world in which he does not belong. He also continually looks down on his victims from a height, and they remain unaware of his presence. So he has the power of the gaze here. And the camera continually assumes his viewpoint. His entrances into scenes are calculated and spectacular, and he's a dominating and manipulating presence throughout. And the next clip is a moment when the full extent of Richard's malevolence is revealed to the young princes. also introduces several striking visual touches to this film. These include the use of coloured lights, of low-key lighting, and the sinister presence of Richard's shadow, which basically affects everything that's going on. Heller described the style of the film as a kind of Eastman colour effect in Technicolor, really to match the deliberately artificial sets and exteriors. However, the climactic battle scene, which was shot on location in the bright sunshine of Spain, provides a very different kind of texture and tone, and it is a strange kind of opening up of the whole drama at the end. But it's also the point at which the power that Richard has yielded is destroyed. Now, Richard III was sold to NBC television and broadcast on TV in the States in 1956, where it was watched by millions of people, and arguably did more than any other production to bring Shakespeare to a wide contemporary popular audience in America. So from the late 50s, Heller then photographs a range of films in CinemaScope, which was the anamorphic wide format developed for 20th Century Fox and used by the studio since 1953. And here's just an example of those, including two westerns, The Sheriff of Fractured Jaw and The Singer Not the Song, Ferry to Hong Kong, A Dog of Flanders, The Big Show, and Light in the Piazza. So again, what we're seeing here is that Heller is being regularly employed on quite big budget international colour productions. But the end of the 50s also marked a really important moment, because this was when Heller teamed up with director Michaela Powella on the film Peeping Tom, which is a dark tale of a psychopathic cameraman who murders women, filming his victims at the point of death. While critically panned when it was released, Peeping Tom has subsequently become one of Britain's most important cult films, made by one of its foremost celebrated directors, and is now often discussed alongside Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which appeared in the same year. Now, Peeping Tom is a study of extreme voyeurism, and like The Lady Killers, provided Heller with an opportunity to blend realism or naturalism through settings and locations, including Pinewood Studios, with a Gothic expressionism that allowed the exploration of the subconscious and the repressed side, not only of its main character, but also of 1950s London, which is a rather drab and colourless place, but one where you can see bubbling up the kind of repressed passions of sexuality and even a darker side. Moreover, the intense subjectivity explored in the film makes the audience complicit in the sadistic voyeurism that it displays. The film begins with the murder of a prostitute, but quickly reveals the killer as Mark Lewis, a photographer who works as a focus puller in the film industry, but also takes pornographic pictures in his spare time. And these jobs bring Mark into contact with various kinds of women, women who rely on being looked at or desired. The prostitute, the actress, the model. Mark also befriends a young woman, Helen, who lives with her mother downstairs in the house Mark owns, and she discovers his screening room where he watches the films that he makes. And this next clip depicts that moment when Mark shows Helen one of his films. Now, Heller's use of Eastman colour stock in this film, which was less refined in Technicolor, provides a slightly grubby or cheap veneer to the glamour and the mundaneness of London life. And in another way that we've seen already in The Lady Killers, Peeping Tom develops the tensions between a recognisable social and physical world and the fantasy space of the house. And this film remains, I think, one of the most significant, if still controversial, productions that Heller photographed in his long career. Now, the early 1960s saw Heller team up again with Basil Dearden and Michael Ralph following their 3 previous collaborations at Ealing. This resulted in 2 social problem films shot in black and white: Victim, which is about a barrister being blackmailed for his repressed homosexuality, and Life for Ruth, which is about a seriously ill girl whose parents' religious beliefs lead them to reject a life-saving blood transfusion. But these 2 films were followed by the rather different, glossy international thrillers made for United Artists. Woman of Straw, 1964, which stars Sean Connery, then James Bond, and Gina Lollobrigida, and the more comedic Masquerade, featuring Jack Hawkins and Cliff Robertson. Now, during the 1960s, an increasing number of British films were being financed by Hollywood, which boosted budgets, production values, and the importance of stars to provide international appeal. This was also the era of swinging London, when the British capital became synonymous with contemporary style and modernity. And this is the context for the final phase of Otto Heller's career, including these 2 final collaborations with Dearden and Ralph. But more significant than either of these is this film, The Ipcress File, made in 1965 and adapted from Len Deighton's 1962 spy novel. The Ipcress File was a film that made Michael Caine a star in the role of Harry Palmer, the insubordinate counter-espionage agent who is tasked with investigating the disappearance of British military scientists. He spends time tracking the prime suspect, who has connections to the Albanian Secret Service, but before long suspects that he's being set up by his superiors. The Ipcress File was produced by Canadian Harry Saltzman, who was co-producer with Cubby Broccoli of the James Bond films. And he retained the services of Bond designer Ken Adam and composer John Barry for the Ipcress File. But this film is in many ways styled as an anti-Bond, in its emphasis on grubby and sleazy environments, and on having an anti-hero who wears spectacles as the protagonist, a long way from the glamour of 007. This was also the breakthrough film for the Canadian director Sidney J. Furie, who at the time was 32 and Heller was 68, and the relationship between the 2 has been compared to that between the young Orson Welles working with the experienced Greg Toland on Citizen Kane. The Ipcress File was shot in Techniscope, which was another widescreen format, but this time a more low-budget one, that used half a standard 35mm frame, and so basically used half the frame and meant you could, use half the amount of stock. It was developed in Technicolor in Rome, and used on many spaghetti westerns, including Sergio Leone's famous Dollars trilogy. Heller had also used it previously on a Hammer horror film, The Curse of the Mummies 2. But he was to use it to extraordinary effect in the Ipcress file. And what's important here is the approach to framing, with foreground objects and people often obscuring the key action going on in the background, with a proliferation of off-kilter and skewed images, creating a mise-en-scène that reflects the unstable and perilous environment of espionage, as well as enhancing the sense of tension between characters, which can also be about threat, but also, in the case of Harry and one of his co-workers, sexual tension. And here's a good example of a few of these techniques. Now, one critic has written that the shape of scope is highlighted. What it does, it focuses on the geometry of looking, particularly planes of view. Some of the compositions create a striking axis of intersecting diagonals that film schools now screen the Ipcress file as an example of what could be achieved with widescreen composition. Other aspects of Furie and Heller's radical approach include really obtuse compositions, shooting from unusual vantage points. You see through symbols here. There's a famous scene shot from inside a phone box where Harry Palmer has a fight with a guy, but the camera never gets out. There's the image shot through the lampshade of a dead American agent. And then there's this image of Dolby, who is Michael Caine's, Harry Palmer's boss, and that big red chunk is a lampshade, but it's almost like an abstract composition. All of this ensures that the film continually provides visual interest and different forms of kind of tension and interest. And the critic Jonathan Murray has also noted that the visual scheme implies the presence of the viewer as a clandestine, voyeuristic presence, possessed of troubling, unspecified allegiances and agendas. So it's almost like the camera's point of view is another character altogether that we're never quite sure where it belongs. For this innovation, Heller was given his first major award, a BAFTA for Best Cinematography in 1966, the year that he turned 70. So, not bad. Heller went on to shoot the next Harry Palmer film, Funeral in Berlin, but the director this time was Guy Hamilton, who had made some of the Bond films, and who rejected Furie's elaborate style. But Heller still manages to give the film a powerful noir sensibility. He was first choice for Billion Dollar Brain, the third Harry Palmer film, which was to feature locations in Finland, but he refused to take a medical to get insurance, and so was replaced with another cinematographer, bringing to an end his association with the Harry Palmer films. But Heller was reunited with Michael Caine in 1966 on another film, Alfie, which is Lewis Gilbert's adaptation of Bill Naughton's play about a narcissistic womanizer. The character of Alfie frequently breaks the fourth wall in direct address to camera, which recalls Richard III, but for a very different purpose, as we can see here. So this film charts the adventures of Alfie as he moves from one romantic encounter to another. But there's a central dramatic tension between the celebration of sexual freedom, which was a key theme of the swinging 60s, and Alfie's selfish and exploitative behaviour. I mean, he treats women appallingly in this film. But in it, again, there's another kind of dimension to this film, apart from this kind of celebration of sexuality. And that is, it's a document of 60s culture and of London as a place of contradictions and tensions. So, on one hand, we have moments of glamour, of tourist landmarks, of a London that we can all recognise. But it captures a different side of London, one populated by working class people living again in quite grimy streets, in cramped apartments, and also, you know, with moments of kind of industrial wasteland. So again, what we've got is elements of this film that seem to belong more to the tradition of the kitchen sink realism that was associated with films set in the northern cities of Manchester, Leeds and Bradford, as well as having London as the, if you like, the glitzy modern capital of the world. So we move really into the final years of Heller's career, but he continued to be incredibly productive. And he made, in the late 60s, a number of rather modish films, often involving big American stars. These include The Naked Runner, which starred and was produced by Frank Sinatra. It was directed by Sidney Furie from The Ipcress File. I'll Never Forget What's His Name, which was directed by Michael Winner. Don't Raise the Bridge, Lower the River, starring the American comedian Jerry Lewis. And Duffy, featuring James Coburn. Otto Heller continued to work right up to the end, and his death on the 17th of February 1970. And his final film, which was released after he died, was Bloomfield, directed by the actor Richard Harris. So, how to sum up this extraordinary 50-year or more career? Firstly, I think what's notable is the sheer productivity and extent of Otto Heller's output, both before he came to Britain and during the 30 years he was making films in Britain. Secondly, the changes that he negotiated in film production and technology, in styles, in working in different countries. He mastered them all, and he kept moving on to the next phase. And I think that's one of the reasons why he kept being in demand and kept making extraordinary films. Thirdly, he was able to serve the vision of a wide range of directors. He clearly worked very well with people. He understood what they wanted. And this is what, in some cases, resulted in, I think, masterpieces. And if we consider the key films that I've highlighted today and which are being shown at this festival, what we see in a number of them is a recurring tension between realism and expressionism, between the creation of an exterior world that we can recognise and an interior world that is complex and dangerous. And Heller's ability to explore this fundamental tension through the resources of cinematography, I think, is one of the things that sets him apart as a great cinematographer. And it's this creation of images that provide us with and document a recognisable physical and social world, most notably images of London at different points, integrated with this exploration of psychic states, extreme emotions, and the sheer complexity of the human condition. For me, the standout films are those that tell a compelling story, but also provide a profound meditation on the relationships between images, the self, and the world. And I think in different ways, Queen of Spades, Peeping Tom, and the Ipcress File offer that level of sophistication. Although that's just my my opinion, and the other films that we're showing today have equal kind of interest. Hopefully you'll get to see most of them, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you. So I think we're now going to have a question and answer session. So I will try and liberate this microphone and sit down. How's that? Is that okay?
Když se zeptám česky, jestli můžu se to překládat. Děkuji za krásnou přednášku, ale velmi by mě zajímalo, když jste zmínil film.
Jo.
Oh, I can. Oh, wonderful. Oh, perfect. This is very impressive. Yeah.
Takže velmi zajímavá přednáška a mám dotaz ohledně filmu Richard III. Víme, sám jste říkal, že se natočil na formát 70 mm, Vision. Krátce předtím tento systém uvedl v život Michael Todd, čili Oťánek, použil systém, který byl úplně nový, ještě nebyl prakticky vyzkoušen, ale v jeho kariéře je to jenom jeden film na 70 mm formát. Netočil ty filmy na ten formát, protože je to obtížné, složité, nebo proč natočil jenom jeden film a pak se vrátil na ten formát CinemaScope. A pak ještě mám jednu otázku, to se chtěla zeptat Martička. Kolik měl dětí Otto Heller, kolik měl vnuků, pravnuků a průnuků?
Okay, the second question, I have no idea. No idea. So VistaVision, originally it wasn't 70 millimeter. What it was 35 millimeter film, but going through horizontally rather than vertically. So two frames were exposed at one time. So you had a big negative. So it's you're getting towards the idea of larger frame. It was a process that wasn't used a lot even in the United States. Mainly because it required a special camera. CinemaScope, you could use a normal camera with a special lens which squeezed the image. So you just needed lenses, but for VistaVision you needed the camera. It was expensive, the film stock was expensive, and so it was an experimental phase really, that in the end, like many other systems that needed special cameras, it became a minority system. You're correct, Heller only used on one film, because there were very few films in Britain made on VistaVision. There was a small number in the 50s. And I'm thinking of the classics made in VistaVision, even in Hollywood, and the person who used VistaVision, I think, the most successfully was Hitchcock, because he used it on To Catch a Thief, I think The Trouble with Harry, possibly, certainly Vertigo, and North by Northwest. But again, by the 60s, it wasn't being used so much. So I think Olivier probably was able to use it. And the film, Richard III, was produced by Alexander Korda. It was one of the last films that Korda produced. So he was a producer who had power and was able to get money. So I think it's because it was a prestige film and because the system was very good for the style of shooting with long takes and deep focus. And yeah, so that was why it was used on this production, but then hardly ever again. Really, it was CinemaScope, and then when CinemaScope was superseded by Panavision, because Panavision was a similar system, it was a lens, that's all you needed, and a lens on the camera. So yeah, that's the main reason. Thank you.
Děkuji. Slyšíme se? Ano. Mě by zajímalo, jestli jste při hodnocení profesionální kariéry pana Hellera vycházel jenom z jeho díla, anebo jste se dostal i třeba k nějakým jeho osobním vzpomínkám, nějakým rozhovorům, zápiskům a podobně. Děkuji.
I mainly watch the films. There isn't a lot about Otto Heller that's been published in English. There is one article in American Cinematographer which covers his work on Richard III. There are small appreciations in some of the publications by the British Society of Cinematographers. There are some books about key directors, like Powell, Alexander Mackendrick, Thorold Dickinson, that talk about Heller. And Dickinson wrote about Heller to say how important he was as a creative collaborator. Michaela Powella is very generous about Heller in his own autobiography. But there actually is very little. I mean, the one thing I did discover from an article written by Jerry O'Hara was that Heller's English was never very good, despite the fact he lived in the UK for a long time. He had a thick accent, and he often had people who would help him understand some of the details of the scripts. And I have the impression that he was probably quite a private man. This is why I know nothing about his children or his grandchildren. But no, for me the main thing was to look at the films, and when I first came across Otto Heller, 35 years ago, it's a long time, I researched and wrote a book on the history of British cinema, and I used it to find out about British cinema, but I focused on cinematography. And then I went and interviewed people who were still alive. So I met one or two people who worked with Otto Heller, but because Heller died so long ago, there was little trace. It's a real shame. But then, you know, he was born so long ago, and although he died, well, 73 it's not old, but he packed a lot in his career. But no, in English there is very little written about him. It's why someone like me is at this festival, because JJ got in touch to say, has anything been written about Otto Heller since your book, which was published in 1996? And I looked and I said no, and it was a case of, well, would you like to help us with this? So yeah, so I think my little bit on him is one of the things that has been quoted by some others too. It's a real shame because you know, we can never really find out the details unless people leave these kinds of documents. I don't know if he ever wrote an unpublished memoir or anything like that. So.
V souvislosti jsem se právě chtěla zeptat, nakolik si myslíte, že ta výsledná práce byla opravdu záležitost pana Hellera, nebo nakolik spolupracoval třeba s režisérem. Protože my jsme teď zvyklí vídat, jak režiséři si připravují storyboardy, v podstatě mají ten film už připravený. A vy jste tady hovořil o tom, jak byla velmi důležitá jako jeho role jako kameramana a ten úhel pohledu na to. Děkuju.
That is, I think, a very difficult one, because I think a lot of the ideas were the directors in the films, because the most interesting films that Heller shot were with the most interesting directors. And Heller's skill was to turn a director's idea into images. And I suspect many of the creative choices around framing, composition, obviously the choice of lights, the use of camera movement, many of those Heller would have had a lot to do with. Perhaps not everything. I mean, a director like Thorold Dickinson, a director like Michaela Powella had a strong idea what they wanted. Alexander Mackendrick, I've interviewed other cinematographers who'd worked with Mackendrick, and they all said the same thing. Mackendrick could never make up his mind. And that suggests to me that in The Lady Killers, there's probably quite a lot of Heller, and also the style of The Lady Killers seems to me to kind of, it's by someone who understands expressionism very well and is very comfortable with it. In the Ipcress file, Sidney Furie was the one that wanted all the crazy angles and the crazy compositions. But again, Heller was the one that made them. Heller was the one that created them. So I think the top cinematographers are usually translators of ideas of directors, rather than being auteurs. And most cinematographers that I've interviewed don't want to be auteurs. They like having wide variety of different styles, of different approaches, whereas someone with a distinctive style, it's more limited. And Heller, if you look at the breadth of his career, it's extraordinary, the range. But you can see certain recurring elements. I think you can tell he's a continental. He's someone who grew up in the silent era, where the use of shadow, light and shadow and composition provided both an objective world, but also to explore what's underneath. Because I think the most interesting thing about cinematography is how do you photograph things that don't exist in the world, that are somehow subjective. And Expressionism was the time and the era where that began to be explored. And I think Heller carried that with him all the way through his career.
Dobrý den. Děkuji za krásnou přednášku, velmi zajímavou. A já jsem se chtěla zeptat, je něco známé o tom, jestli i nadále byl Otto Heller v kontaktu s jinými československými tvůrci, kteří byli třeba v emigraci, protože Lady Killers vlastně vystupuje třeba Herbert Wong, tak to mě tak zaujalo, nebo i s jinými tvůrci, se kterými spolupracovali ještě před válkou, jako třeba Wolbrook. Díky.
Again, that's very difficult to say because of the lack of documents that are personal. It's interesting that the three other Czechs that I put up there, Otto Kančerek died in 1940, I think, so round about the time when Heller came to live in Britain permanently. But Mackendrick was a major figure in the 30s because he was the head cameraman at one of the major studios, and he was very influential. But I don't know if Heller knew him. I guess he must have known him because they both worked in the Czech industry in the 1920s and 30s. Jan Stalic came back, and I think he made films during the Nazi period. I mean, I don't know a lot about him, but I know he came back. Whereas Franz Planer went to Hollywood and, you know, had a major career. You know, one of the things that I'm not sure about is how much there was an emigre community in Britain. I guess one of the big differences is because Heller was Czech, he was never an enemy alien, I don't think, in the way that someone like Walbrook would have been. And, you know, Germans, the Austrians, you know, they were, oh, excuse me, they had a hard time. When the war broke out, some of them were sent to internment camps. They weren't allowed to have radios. But I think the thing that is clear to me is the fact that Heller was making films from the early 40s clearly was because he was able to. He wasn't seen as a potential problem. And so I guess, and this is only a guess, that the people he was most close to would have been other emigres who were not classified as aliens. But I don't know, and whether he was friends with Walbrook, I mean, as I say, they worked together a few times in the 1930s, so he obviously knew him very well. One person he was clearly very, very close to as professionally was Gus Driss, who I mentioned. Now, Gus Driss was a French-born camera operator, and I haven't been able to find out enough about him, about when he came to Britain. But the fact that they worked together on 25, 26 films means that they were obviously, that was a very close relationship. But no, I'm really not sure about who else he would have been friends with. You know, in the American case, there are kind of accounts of the way in which the emigres all knew each other and would attend parties together. And many of them, of course, were not particularly happy in California. I think in London, some went back. Some stayed, some went back. And so it was different. It was probably more fluid. What I don't know is whether Heller, he didn't make any films back in this country, but whether he came back and forward and still had, you know, old friends, I don't know. I guess for some Jews, they could never go back. The memories. Plus also, I guess, it went from the Nazis to the Soviets, and so it wasn't so easy to, and of course Heller died a long time before Czechoslovakia became accessible.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Já jsem ještě chtěla poprosit, jestli byste nám doporučil nějaké další kameramany, kteří stojí za to se o ně takhle víc zajímat, podobně jako o Hellera. Děkuju.
Oh, many. I mean, British ones, continentals in Britain. I mean, my favourite cinematographers in terms of British cinema, Jack Cardiff, who, you know, worked with Powell and Pressburger, The Red Shoes, Black Narcissus, A Matter of Life and Death. Guy Green, who photographed Oliver Twist and Great Expectations for David Lee. Douglas Slocum, who made many of the Ealing films, including a film called Saraband for Dead Lovers, which is not a great film, but it's an early Technicolor film, and it's set in the 18th century, and it was shot on location in Prague. in 1947, so in that period before the Soviets took over. Who else? Ozzie Morris, another amazing cinematographer. There are many of them. Of the other European emigres who came, one that's very interesting is Otto Heller, who photographed A Canterbury Tale and I Know Where I'm Going for Powell and Pressburger. And again, someone else who was very, you know, he'd worked at UFA and he understood German expressionist technique. So when I studied the history of British cinema, what impressed me was how many films, the cinematography was really incredible, but yet British cinema for a long time was regarded as an uninteresting cinema. That somehow, someone said, I think it was Truffaut, said that the British were just not, their temperament wasn't suited for the movie camera. But yet all of these cinematographers, and many of them won Oscars, there are many Oscar-winning British cinematographers, which seem to contradict what Truffaut was saying. I think we may be done. Thank you very much. It was very nice to have this opportunity, and thank you very much for the fascinating questions.